give him time.
So there are a number of questions that I want to raise that I think are very practical and should be considered, and they're addressed here in this essay for Parshas Vayeitze, where Yaakov Avinu promises HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if God will protect him and give him food to eat and clothing to wear, then Kol Asher Titein Li Aser Asrenu Lach. And the word Asrenu comes from the Shorish Ma'aser, which is 1/10, and it seems that Yaakov Avinu pledged 1/10 of his possessions. Now, the following questions arise. Number one, we have a group of great scholars called Holchei Usha, which means that after the Jewish people went into Golus, the Sanhedrin went from one place to the other, and wherever they stopped, if they could organize the 71 elders, then they would establish the Sanhedrin. And in a place called Usha, there was a Sanhedrin that instituted many different gzeros and siyagim, and amongst them was a siyag which, according to the Gemara Ksubis, has to do with the mitzvah of tzedakah. So the question arises, and this is what Holchei Usha are going to hopefully address for us, is how much money do I have to allocate for tzedakah? Now, of course, today we have all sorts of things like, tax deductible, and I have somebody who wanted to really take a major part in contributing to publish the Sefer. So he's been working for weeks to figure out how he can get tax deductible. That's it. But in any event, so that's the way it goes. And I would like to know, how much money do I have to allocate for tzedakah? And it would seem from Holchei Usha that the source for this is none other than Yaakov Avinu and none other than this week's parasha, Parshas Vayeitze. And therefore, in Usha, they establishes, and that's going to be the first paragraph that you want to see on your page here, is Hamvazbeis al Yivazbeis Yoser Michomish, which literally translates that you should spend no more than 20% of your income. Now, question number one, when you talk about income, are we talking about liquid assets and only liquid assets? Like, let's say if a person has no money in the bank virtually, maybe has a little bit left from his stay in Toronto, in TD Bank. I don't know if they'll ever give us access to that, but especially if they find out that I served in the Israeli army. But be that as it may, uh, I don't even know if I'm going to get into New York tomorrow, but that's a different question. He doesn't take office until January, so I think I get in under the wire. But getting back to our topic here, if let's say I have zero money in the bank, but I have an apartment that's worth $1 million, it's worth $10 million. I can theoretically liquidate that. So we don't know exactly at this point. I'm just raising a number of questions. How do you decide what percentage of your assets you should allocate for tzedakah? Question number two, when we say allocate for tzedakah, maybe the halacha is a little bit more flexible in terms of allocation. But what happens if there's a poor person in front of me, an ani b'fanav, what we call, and he's really down and out, he needs my help. So I'm going to start calculating, well, you know what? I allocated this amount and that's about all I can allocate. So in addition to the tax deductible limitation, you now have another limitation that my assets are just so, I can't give you one penny more. And that leads me really to the third question. What did they establish in Usha? Did Usha establish that I can spend X amount of money for tzedakah, but I can't go overboard beyond 20%? And in effect, what I see saying Ula, sorry, I meant Usha. What they established in Usha was a limitation as to how much money. I mean, let's say I'm a very great, magnanimous donor. I like to give to many different, organizations and causes. The establishment at Usha was that don't go overboard, maximum up to 20%. However, it doesn't seem like from the language of Holchei Usha that they were establishing the minimum amount. They were establishing a ceiling. Don't go beyond 20%. So let's just summarize our third question here. That third question is, did Holchei Usha establish that under all circumstances, the maximum I could give is 20%? Or did Ula say that you should give 20%? That's what you're required to give. If you're a very magnanimous person and you have a great deal of funds and you also have a great deal of faith in God, then give as much as you want. Question number 4, does this halacha of Usha apply only to the mitzvah of tzedakah or to any mitzvah? So let's say, for example, I need to buy myself a pair of tefillin, and I have total assets of 1,000. And the tefillin are going to cost me 500, 50% of my assets. Does that also come under the proclamation at Ula of Usha that no, you're not going to give 50% for a mitzvah? And as we'll soon see, Rav Weiss Shlita in his Minchas Osher assumes that you have many mitzvahs that all bombard you. You know, you have 613 mitzvahs. You have to be sure to allocate money for each one of those mitzvahs. So even though right now you have a pressing need to buy tefillin, but nevertheless, if you spend all that much money on tefillin, you haven't left yourself enough money for Shabbos or for, I don't know, putting up a mezuzah, buying an esrog, whatever it might be. So therefore, we have to ask that question. What happens with regard to mitzvos in general? Now, there's a very important Rambam at the end of Hilchos Erchin. And as you know, the Rambam is wont to dedicate the last halacha or 2 halachas in any section to give us chizuk and to inspire us to do that mitzvah which is recorded in that section. And you'll find this umatum over and over again. In the case of Erchin, where a person is being magdish his nechasim for what we call bedek habayis, the Rambam writes at the end of Hilchos Erchin, and Bli Neder, I'm going to bring over Rambam so we see the language, because it's very important to see the language, but the Rambam tells us, don't spend more than 20% of your nechasim, of your income, for the sake of Erchin and Hegdesh. And the Rambam even adds an explanation. He says, because what's going to happen is, if you give more than 20%, you might not have enough money for your own needs, and you'll end up, we used to call it, I don't know, in Canada, if they have this phrase, panhandling, you're going to have to beg, people to give you funds. So you want to help another person, but at the end, you're shooting yourself in the foot. But from the fact that the Rambam brings this down in Hilchos Erchin, where he's not discussing the mitzvah of tzedakah, but rather the mitzvah of hegdesh, it doesn't seem like the Rambam is limiting the Holchei Usha svara of Al Yivaz Beis Yosef Michomesh to tzedakah. He seems to expand it way beyond the confines of tzedakah. So Bli Neder, if we get a chance, I'd like to open up the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Erchin and read his language carefully. Now, one other question that I want to ask before we plunge into the sugya is the following question. The world was not a void before Holchei Usha came along. Anytime you see a gzera or a siag that was instituted by the Chachamim, and especially here by the Sanhedrin, you always have to ask yourself methodologically, what was the situation before the gzera? So, for example, if I have an issue about taking medicine on Shabbos, so I know that before the gzera of refuah on Shabbos, I was allowed to take medicine on Shabbos. There's no, I didn't grind up the contents and the drugs of the medicine, and so forth and so on. You always have to ask yourself, at what point did the Rabbanan step in, change the Torah law, and why did they do so? And here, in that context, we have to raise another methodological question that should be consistently asked, and that is what powers, what authorities do the Rabbanan have? For example, can the Rabbanan take a mitzvah and say, don't fulfill that mitzvah? Well, as you know, the shofar issue on Rosh Hashanah of Shabbos came up, and you have the Gzeira of Rabbah. That seems to be an extension of the authority of the Chachamim, that they can even tell you not to fulfill a mitzvah. The Torah says blow the shofar, and you're not going to blow the shofar. But then keep in mind that, number one, that's only b'shei v'al taseh. The Rabbanan can't tell you to eat treifas. And number two, please keep in mind that the Rabbanan are only doing so to protect the violation of the Torah. The Rabbanan are saying, not that we want to make life easier for you and therefore don't blow the shofar on Shabbos, but rather the Rabbanan are saying, we don't want you to violate the Shabbos. So it's really a toss-up between the Shabbos and the shofar. The Torah says, go ahead with the shofar. It's not a violation of the Shabbos, but the Rabbanan said in our reality, we have a different society, and in our society, we have to forfeit the mitzvah of shofar, because otherwise we might come to violate the Shabbos. And the Shabbos is higher up on the Richter scale than shofar. So having said that, we come back to Usha, and we're asking, number one, what was the situation before Usha? How much money was I required, A, for tzedakah, and B, for other mitzvahs? And therefore, what was Usha really trying to accomplish? And if you take a look here in your pages, again, I'm not sure if you have them, but you have them in your email, and thank you, David, you'll see that in the very first paragraph, he quotes the Gemara Ksubas on Daf Nun, and the Gemara derives from Yaakov Avinu that Holchei Usha, and this is called an asmachta, where the Rabbanon, bring a pasuk in the Chumash or in Tanakh to sort of like support. It's an allusion from the Torah. It's not a Doraisa, but very often the Rabbanon want to bring in a asmachta. So the asmachta is from Yaakov Avinu, Aser Tasrenu Lo. Again, the funny kind of thing is that the percentage that Holchei Usha are talking about is 20%. Yaakov Avinu is talking about 10%. So the Gemara says, but why does he use a double language? Aser, asrenu. Wouldn't it be enough to say asrenu? But the double language means he has to take one meiser and then another meiser, totaling 20%. Of course, you could always ask the old kasha, about Trumas Meiser and so forth. The old kasha, the mathematical kasha, is that if you mafresh 10%, you're only left with 90%. And therefore, when you're going to be mafresh 10% from the remaining 90%, you're left with you're only left with 9 and not 10, if you know what I mean. So you don't really have a second 10th. You'll have 19%, not 20%. But in any event, the bottom line is we find here a remez in the Torah for Maser times 2, which is Chomesh, which is 1/5 or 20% of your profit. But then in the second paragraph, he quotes the Chassam Sofer. And as you know, the Chassam Sofer was the great rabbi back in Pressburg 150 years ago, more even. You can go today, it's no longer part of Hungary now, it's part of Slovakia. You can go there, they have a street with a bus stop. The bus stops at the street called the Chassam Sofer, because you can go see the kever of the Chassam Sofer. Yeah, okay, it's for them, it's a money-making thing. Anyway, but be that as it may. So Chassam Sofer says, if you take a look in the second paragraph, that Minat Torah, according to Torah law, before Holchei Usha came along, Chayav Adam Levazves Kol Mamono. V'chol sheyesh lo parnosas yomo, Chayav Litein La'oni Kol Shar Mamono. Wild. The Torah is saying that make sure you have enough money to get through the day, and God will help you tomorrow, but right now you got through the day, and all the rest of your monies you have to give to tzedakah. Rabbosai, are you with me on this? This is what the Torah requires according to Chassam Sofer. You know, the Chassam Sofer is no slouch. And he says that the Torah requires you to give everything. Don't spare yourself a dime as long as you can make it through the day. So how much does it cost per day? Let's say it costs me $150 and I'll get through the day. I have enough money to pay for a roof, for a pair of socks on my feet, and a couple of meals. You know, I'll have pizza in the morning. All right, pizza's getting expensive these days, but in any event, I can get through the day. And in a very atypical way, Rav Asher Weissschliter does not feel comfortable with this Chassam Sofer. And he writes here, if you take a look, he says that Zer Rachok, this is very far from our understanding. Lo mistaber de me'atorah chayav adam litein es kol asher lo la'ani v'hu atzmo ye'ani. Imagine if you have only enough parnasa for one day, technically, according to the halacha, you are classified as an ani. You could go out there, according to halacha, and go collect leket, shikha, peah, meiser, you name it. So the Torah wants you to give all your money away and become an ani. We can't design. How could it be? Not only that, but he says that this is a very strange case because according to the Chassam Sofer, the Rabbanan are invoking their power, their authority, to be oker a mitzvah min Torah. Okay, fine. We've seen that. We saw it on Shofar on Shabbos. But nevertheless, when the Rabbanan do such a thing, they're coming to strengthen the fulfillment of the mitzvah Torah. We want you to fulfill the mitzvah of Shabbos, and even if you're going to forfeit the mitzvah of Shofar, it's for the sake of observing the Shabbos. But now, according to Chassam Sofer, what are we saying? We're saying that for your own benefit, don't give away all your money. The Torah requires you to give all your money. And now the whole Chayush are establishing, invoking their powers and their authority. No, don't give away all your money. But the Torah says I have to give away all my money. Does that come under Yesh Koch B'Yad Chachamim? And beyond that, the Minchas Osher raises the following question. How could it be that according to the Torah law, you have to give up all your money? The Gemara says in Bava Kama that you should give for, let's say, the Gemara there is discussing a Hidur mitzvah, but it doesn't matter. It's not relevant to us now. But the Gemara says if you're going to give ad shlish, you're going to give 1/3 of all your monies. Then what happens if you have 3 different chiyuvim? Yeah, like let's say you have 3 different mitzvahs. So if you give away 1/3 to each one, you're left with 0. And if a 4th mitzvah comes along, you don't have a penny to buy that 4th mitzvah. So you see clearly that the Gemara's logic was that the Torah did not require me to give up every last dime, every last cent that I have. So we think that Rav Asher Weiss, with his incredible scope of knowledge, is going to quote the Netziv Mivalozhin in the next paragraph to calm us down as an alternative to the Chassam Sofer. That's what I thought was going to happen here. But whoa, was I disappointed. If you take a look on the left column, top paragraph, he quotes the Netziv, who says that the Rabbanan are allowed to violate the Torah law and tell you to spend up to, but not beyond 20% because of kavod habrios. We have a principle, like for example, let's say you find, I don't know, a roaming animal, and the only way you can return it to its rightful owner would be to carry it on your shoulders, and it's not appropriate for you. It would be a violation of your dignity. So the Gemara establishes in Masechta Brachos that we're going to say don't do the mitzvah. Why not? Because of the dignity of man, of kavod habrios. Gadol kavod habrios shedocha lo saseh b'Torah. If you look the other way, avert your eyes when you see an aveda, that's a violation of a Torah law of lo sucha l'salit. But we're going to allow you to violate the law because of the dignity of man. Again, it's only going to be b'shevi al taseh, but fine. So here, the Netziv wants to activate that sugya, that principle, and say that if you're going to give away all your money, then your dignity is going to go down, down, down. You're going to be so humiliated that you have to, you have to sell yourself and raise the funds. But again, you see clearly from the Nitzif that he held that if not for the fact that there was a dolcha here to override the law, and namely Kovod Abrius was a dolcha, if not for that, you'd have to give away all your money and become an ani. And basically, we're back to square one to the Chassam Sofer. In the third paragraph, he quotes a Yerushalmi. Good. We're all excited because we hope that if we didn't do too well in the Bavli, maybe we'll do better in the Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi says that in order to understand Holchei Usha, we have to invoke another principle which is very common in Shas, that I'll give a little background. Sometimes the Mesorah, the transmission of Torah Shebal Peh, was partially interrupted. The Jewish people went from one Golus to the other Golus, and Hadar shachachu v'hadar ichziruhu. The scholars in a certain generation would now remind us, or shall we say resurrect from the dead, what the original halacha was. So the Torah doesn't tell me how much money I have to spend for a mitzvah, but we knew exactly how much money that was and what percentage of my assets I have to give. How we knew it is going to be the question of the Vilna Gaon, but we'll get back to that in just a second. But it was forgotten. So the Holchei Usha came along and they remembered what was the original halacha according to Torah law. So in a sense, we find some sort of nechama here in the words of the Yerushalmi. Why? Because Yerushalmi is saying that the original halacha was 20%. The Torah did not require us to spend more than 20%. We had forgotten that, and the Holchei Usha, by using the asmachta from Yankiv Avinu, they came up with a resurrection from the dead of the halacha that was transmitted, that was lost in the course of the Golus. The Gaon asked the question, the Vilna Gaon, how, according to Shalmi, what did they originally know this halacha? You're saying it's part of Torah Shebal Peh? Says the Gaon, it's halacha Moshe Misinai. Anyone who tells you that we have only one Torah, tell him he's making a big mistake. We have two Torahs. One Torah is Torah Shebechsav, the other Torah is Shebal Peh. And the Torah Shebal Peh was given to Moshe Rabbeinu in Har Sinai orally, passed on in the transmission of Torah. Sometimes it was lost. And greater sages had to come along during the course of time and as I said before, to recreate and reestablish what was originally known. So this halacha of Usha then comes out to be a very fundamental halacha. It's not like a regular gzeira or a siag. This is the original Torah law. And what is that original Torah law? And we said one of two possibilities. Either the Torah was saying the ceiling, don't spend more than 20%, or the Torah was saying, you know what, you're not obligated to give more than 20%. If you want to give more than 20%, that's your business. We're not going to interfere with you. So under certain circumstances, a man has a lot of money in the bank. Even if he gives away 50% of his money, he has plenty of money to spend to raise his family, to do the mitzvahs, and to serve Hashem. But as I said at the outset, the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Erchin says, no, if you're going to spend more than 20%, then you'll end up becoming an ani. And the Rambam doesn't make any ifs, ands, or buts about it. He doesn't limit it and say, well, it depends how much money you have in the bank. What are your financial status? I find it very interesting that this whole sugya really reflects what I call in modern contemporary life a diversification of your portfolio. Well, what do I mean by that? We go to a financial advisor, we pay him a lot of money, we show him, what our assets are, and he's going to advise us, don't spend too much money on real estate. If you put in all your money on real estate, if there'll be a drop in the real estate market, you're in trouble. Don't put all your money in the bank. Don't put all your money in securities and stocks and bonds and so forth. And he'll tell you to diversify. And that's more or less what Rav Weiss is saying over here, that there are 613 mitzvahs. You have X amount of money. You have X amount of time, X amount of koach, divvy it up, diversify, make sure that you can cover all your obligations and fulfill the 613. Again, what'll be if there's a conflict between one mitzvah and another? Okay, for that we have dinei kedima and so forth and so on. But fundamentally, you want to get an advisor. So who's the advisor? Who's the advisor in a Torah halachic sense for the sake of mitzvahs? It's Hol Cheyusha. But according to the Yerushalmi, it's Hol Cheyusha, the way the Gaon understands the Yerushalmi, with resurrecting that which was lost, the Halach L'Moshe Sinai, and that's where we get our financial advice, you know. So the good thing is we don't have to pay a financial advisor. Well, maybe a good idea to pay one anyway, but Rav Weiss doesn't like this Gaon. And if you take a look, he says in the last paragraph on the first page, he says, L'chora yesh l'tmoa al Adonenu. He calls the Vilna Gaon Adonenu, our master, Hagaon, the genius, from a different language in the Yerushalmi, which is almost word for word the same Yerushalmi, just in a different Masechta. The first Yerushalmi came from Masechta Peah, and the second Yerushalmi is a little bit further towards the end of Masechta Peah, and there it's quite clear. No, I'm sorry. The second Yerushalmi is in Ksubis. And the second Yerushalmi Ksubis is absolutely clear that it's not a halach l'moshe misina. The Gemara calls it, the Yerushalmi calls it a takonis chacham. And again, if it's takonis chacham, we're sort of like back to square one, because how do you understand that the Torah forces you to give up every penny for the mitzvah tzedakah, and yet the Rabbanan said, you know what, you don't have, forget it, don't pay any attention. Stop at 20%. That's the takonis chacham. So if you take a look on the next page, which is called Taf Nun Aleph, which he calls Ha-Nira Ikar Bozeh. Now, once you see that title, Ha-Nira, which always means I'm going to give you my take on it, Ha-Ikar, which I think is the primary way of going, you know, Rav Weiss is basically telling the Chassam Sofer, you know, you're covered. He's telling the Netziv, you know, sit on the sidelines. He's telling the Vilna Gaon, forget it. He's going to give his own shot. And basically what he says here on this page is really what I would call intuitive. You know, it's not a lumdisha piece. It's not a chiddush. He's just saying what the Torah wanted you to do was to try to figure out how you can diversify your funds, how much money you should spend for this mitzvah, for that mitzvah, depending upon your financial status, depending upon your assets, your kochos, your understanding of your your situation, your kochos, meaning how much work you could do, and your income, and so forth and so on. Basically, the Torah didn't give any sort of a number or any sort of percentage, but rather relied on each individual. And that's your responsibility as a Jew. You have Taryag mitzvahs. That's your responsibility. Figure out and rack your brains how to fulfill all your mitzvahs properly. Came along Chachmei Yehusha, and they said, you know what? We're not going to rely on you. The Torah says rely on you. You know, you're able to figure it out. But you might get carried away for whatever reason. Maybe out of mercy, out of compassion, or maybe you feel, oh, you just won the lottery that day. You know, you're feeling groovy. You want to spend a lot of money on a mitzvah. You're in the mood for a good pair of tefillin, and whatever it might be. So let's read a little bit inside. He says, the emes hashut. It's very simple. To minat Torah, he doesn't have to spend every last dime, make himself into an ani. Halahu chay b'tayig mitzvahs. So this mitzvah tzedakah is a great mitzvah, but it's one of Taryah. Hu tzarach gam leparnosos beis, so he's got to support his family. I'm skipping a few lines. So it gets very dramatic over here with the Hebrew. That's your responsibility. Figure out how to get a portfolio that's diversified, meaning that it covers all the different bases. Oh, now he sort of introduces a little bit of a different concept here. The Torah was particularly vague, as often it is, and sends the ball over to the court of the Chachamim, so that the Chachamim will determine how much you should give. Nimsa adover l'chacham l'kvo ashir ba'otzal mitzvahs hem kavu al pi asmachta mi Yaakov Avinu that it should be a chomesh. Interesting. In the next paragraph, he quotes the Sforno. Not every Talmud Chacham, has time for a Sforno. The Sforno says, Lo she'iten kol asher lo. The Sforno, in essence, 5 centuries ago, whenever he lived, is rejecting the Chasam Sofer and the Nitziv, who came much later. So he doesn't give kol asher lo, v'yitztarech hu librios, and he himself has to go out and collect tzedakah. And vazbeis al yivazbeis yosem michomesh. So according to him, we don't know exactly how much you should be spending, but we know that there's a ceiling, and you can't go beyond that ceiling. And don't give. You able to hear me? There's a little bit of a delay. I guess it has to do with the internet. Okay. Now, in the next section, which you'll see Os Gimel on the bottom of the page that goes on to the next page, the Minchas Osher claims that there's a machlokas rishonim between the Rosh and the Rambam as to whether or not this principle of maximizing at 20% applies to every mitzvah or only to the mitzvah of tzedakah. So he says that the Rosh is actually addressing not the case of tzedakah, but the case of mitzvahs in general. This is on page Taf Nun Beis. And Eino Chayav Levazbeis Hon Rav LeMitzvos. He doesn't have to spend Hon Rav. Mind you, he's not limiting you to a certain percentage. He's saying that just as Holchei Usha established 20% for tzedakah, use your seichel, imitate that precedent, and with regard to mitzvahs, don't give hon rav, which probably means don't give all your, 60%, 70%. But it seems that the original takana did not apply to other mitzvahs. The takana of Usha was limited to tzedakah. Mashma, the ein takana mesuyem es b'chol mitzvahs. There was never a takana of Usha in all the mitzvahs. El demeikar adin Torah eino chayv vazbeis hon rav. So what's hon rav? I don't know. It's very unclear, but maybe it's 60%, 70%. I don't know what it is, but it seems clearly that in other mitzvahs you're allowed to spend more than 20%. Now, I don't understand exactly the logic here. Why would Holchei Usha make this takana only with regard to tzedakah, not with regard to other mitzvahs? I mean, if the logic is we don't want you to become a poor person by spending more than 20% of your assets, then that should apply to any mitzvah. He doesn't address that. But rather he goes on to show that the Rambam held that this principle of Ula applies umatum, straight across the board, every mitzvah. And the Rambam writes at the end of Erech, here we have the language of the Rambam, Li'olam lo yakdish adam lo yachrim kol nechasav va'osekein over al das hakasuv. Now, it's interesting. The Ram has a different pasuk. I think it's I'm not sure what I think it's a Parshas Vayeitze. If you can look it up, I'm not sure. But otherwise, I can get the Rambam. But he says that if he gives so much and so much of his nechasim, then he violates the pasuk. What is the violation of the pasuk? Shareu Omer, the pasuk says, Mikol asher lo. Now the extra mem of Mikol means some of what you have. V'lo kol. If not for the mem, you'd read it kol asher lo. The Ein Zeh Chasidus, the Rambam says. It's very interesting. We have a phrase that appears, I know from the Gemara in Sota, with regard to a guy who doesn't want to jump in to save a woman because, oh, I don't want to save a woman. It's not. So the Gemara calls him a chassid shota. So on Purim, I saw somebody put up a kvittel. You know what a kvittel is when they tell you about the death of someone and they announce his funeral. So they made up this whole kvittel, and instead of calling him a Gomer HaTzadik, they called him a Chassid HaShoita. Very nice. So on the one hand, you want to be a chassid, very nice. Everyone wants to be a chassid. I mean, the chassidim are taking over. Shareu ma'abid mamona v'yitzarch lebrios. Here he's a shota. Don't think automatically that being pious means you're a pious guy and you deserve all the accolades. No. You could be a chassid and a shota in the same time, because now you're going to have to panhandle and raise money. It's ein merachmim Allah. The Rambam says we don't have any mercy on such a person who puts himself into a situation of being a shota. Like he's destroying his own world. And again, the Rambam is not talking about stuck over here. He's talking about the mitzvah of hachrim tach, of giving a cherem and giving erchin. El kol mefazir mamona b'mitzvos. Rambam says beferish b'mitzvos. Al Yefazer Yosef Michomish. Here he's quoting, paraphrasing Cholchei Usha, but he's referring to mitzvahs. And then the Rambam waxes very dramatic, as he always does at the end of the halachos, and he says that Tzivu Anavim Sheyeh Mechalkel Dvarav B'Mishpat Bein B'Divrei Torah Bein B'Divrei Olam Afilu Karbanos, etc., etc. Then he quotes a Yerushalmi that says that there was a certain, I think he's a Tana by the name of Rabbi Yishovev, and they came down very hard on him. Why? Because he gave all his money away. And they said to him, why are you doing such a thing? Chazal say, Ayivazbeis Yosef Michomish ala mitzvos. Now, the fact that the Yerushalmi uses the term ala mitzvos in this context indicates that the principle of Holchei applies to all mitzvahs. The Yerushalmi says that the Takana Hoisa sheyafresh chomesh lemitzvah b'loshen chiyuv. Remember we asked, what does it mean? Don't spend more than 20%, but are you obligated to spend 20%? So he says that from the language of Yerushalmi, it would seem that part of the takana had two parts to it. One part of the takana was to spend 20%, and the other part of the takana is don't spend more than 20%. Sheyafresh chomesh lemitzvah b'loshen chiyuv. Chiyuv means you're obligated. After min Torah ain't tzarich lahafresh shir mesuyam tiknu l'chayiv lahafresh chomesh. So the Torah doesn't say that there's a certain percentage they have to give, but the Rabbanan in Usha established that you have to give a chomesh, but not less than a chomesh, not more than a chomesh. Now, remember I asked you at the outset, and with this we'll try to wrap things up because it's almost mincha time here. And that is, what would happen if an ani is right there in front of you, and you actually gave to whatever causes, great causes, you gave 20%. Or even if you didn't give 20%, but you want to give more than 20%. I mean, this guy is really in need. So he quotes the Yavitz, that's Rav Yaakov Emden, lived about 500 years ago. On the bottom, he says, the whole discussion of Usha is all about how much money to allocate. Umevakesh on the next page, lechem, lecho, tzarch levazves af yoser michomesh. So let's just summarize what we have over here. On the one hand, we see that there's a whole discussion about what was the situation, what did the Torah require before Holchei Usha. And the Minchas Osher rejects the approach of all the commentators who say that before the Torah, before Usha came along, you had to give every last penny, as long as you had enough for one day. But rather, before the Torah was given, it was up to you, and that was part of your responsibility within the context of Avodas Hashem and Taryag Mitzvahs, to calculate how to diversify your money to cover all your needs. Holchei Usha came along and said, wait a minute, you might get carried away, and you might want to give more than 20%. Don't do that. If you give away more than 20%, you might become an owner yourself. What did Holchei Usha have in mind? Did they have in mind all the mitzvahs, or only tzedakah? That seems to be a controversy between the Rosh and the Rambam. What else do we have to know? What did Holchei Usha have in mind? Did they have in mind that you could spend up to 20% but not more? Or do they even have in mind an obligation that you have to pay 20%? So that's another issue that's outstanding here. So we got up to Tov Nun Gimel, and after that, he gets to the issue of lavin, how much you have to spend in order to avoid violating a lav. Till now, we talk about mitzvahs. Yeah.
Can I just ask you, could it be with regards to when they said beforehand that originally it was any amount, that the level of bitachon that a person had was one that he had to feel?
That's what it seems.
Okay.
And if I have bitachon, that even if I only have enough money to get by today, I don't have to worry about tomorrow. They say they asked the Kotzker Rebbe how many mitzvahs there are. So the Kotzker Rebbe said, Adarabba, you tell me how many mitzvahs there are. I know, but do you know? So they all piped up, the Chassidim, they said, Taryag. No, says the Kotzker. There's only one mitzvah. The mitzvah that you're obligated to do now. And this touches on a whole issue. I think I mentioned it to you more than once. If, let's say, somebody will fast on Tzom Gedalia, and the Rofim say that if he does so, he won't be able to fast on Yom Kippur in his situation, his health. So some poskim say, Yom Kippur is a greater mitzvah than Tzom Gedalia. I mean, ain't a dome, right? Doesn't show you. But others say, no, it's the 3rd of Tishrei. You have an obligation to fast. You don't have to concern yourself with what's going to be down the line. Okay, then, so we'll stop here. And like I said at the outset, we'll see, the next 2 weeks I'm traveling, so we'll see how it works out. Okay, then?
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, all the best.